Hello and welcome my friends and viewers to this week's episode of Legendlore, where I draw and talk about monsters, characters, gods, and other things from D&D 5th edition, all while giving a small but quickly digestible history about them. Together we'll go over their history within the game, how they're utilized in the modern edition, and how you guys can utilize them in your own games. This week we'll be going over another one of my favorite D&D gods, one of the few who ascended from being immortal and sits as 1/3 of the legendary Dead 3, that being Bane the Blackhand. Appearing way back amongst the more classic gods in 1st edition, Bane is the Faerunian god of ambition, control, tyranny, and conquest, with his nicknames being the Blackhand, the Strife Emperor, and the Lord of Darkness. Given the heaviness of his epitaphs, I do find it a little bit strange that he's kind of taken a back seat as one of the main bad guys of D&D. But in 5th edition, Bane primarily holds the domains of order and war, carries an alignment of lawful evil, and is primarily worshipped by warmongers, conquerors, and those with ambitions towards power and authority through strength. Bane's favorite animals include bats, corpse-scavenging vultures, black cats, especially those with green eyes, and black dogs, while on the flip side, his favorite monsters include devils, beholders and death tyrants, chromatic black and green dragons, nagas, shadow mastiffs, hellhounds, and other sort of canine-like dog creatures. For those who really want to get noodly into the lore, Bane's favorite materials are black sapphires to show approval, powdered red carnelian to show disapproval, as well as hematite, emeralds, and bloodstone. In relation to that, Bane's holy colors are black, green, and red, which are often used to replace the background of the heraldry of the nations and places he conquers. His holy symbols are either a simple black handprint, a pair of eyes surrounded by either red or green flames, or a flail that is made completely out of chains. The chosen holy symbol varies depending on the culture's view of him, such as if they see him from a position of pure strength, tactical superiority, or tyrannical authority and control, respectively. And lastly, Bane is one of the few gods who does not have a designated divine weapon, choosing instead to wield his own spiked gauntlet hand instead. Now, I don't know about you, but it's gotta take a pretty badass god to choose the pimp hand as his holy weapon. When it comes to his appearance, Bane has been known to take on a couple of different forms. The two most common are a hulking, shirtless male humanoid with small horns, black skin, gauntlets hands, and talon-like fingers and nails, while the other has a more classical feel to it, that being a huge ogre-like warrior in complete head-to-toe heavy black plate covered in spikes, eyes glowing beneath a helmet while the heads of his enemies dangle from his belt. A bit heavy-handed, I know, but Bane strikes me as the heavy-handed type. Most depictions of Bane usually have him emulating the race that worships him, possibly in the belief that anyone or anything can embody his ideals, no matter who you are. I'm also not including K-pop idol Bane from the Dungeons & Dragons Magic card series, because god do I hate it. In terms of personality, Bane's about as much as you would expect from a warmonger, speaking in absolutes, commanding with utmost respect, fear, and authority from his underlings, and carrying an overall intimidating presence. Despite this, Bane does have some inclination towards teamwork and playing on the strengths of others to cover his own weaknesses. Otherwise, he and the Dead 3 would never have succeeded in cutting their way to reach the god of the dead, Jergal. However, this is still a means to an end, with Bane swiftly cutting them off after his goals were achieved. All this is to say that Bane is focused on strength, control, and is primarily out to win, with the belief that the strong not only have the right, but the duty to govern over the weak, as the weak will lead those below them to inevitable ruin. Whereas someone like Asmodeus is more about deception, cunning, and control through bureaucracy and deals, Bane seeks conquest through military might, effectiveness, and through the use of deadly force if needed. In comparison to someone like Tempest or the Red Knight, Bane doesn't keep to the limiting concepts of honor or rules of engagement. Whatever is the most effective and gets the most results is good enough for him, even if it requires deceit or refusal to meet someone on the same playing field. One-on-one duels of honor and holding mercy for the wounded or captured are anathema to his tenets, as compassion is a weakness that he cannot afford in his quest for control. In terms of Bane's abilities, his most obvious one is that he's a cunning and dangerous warrior and tactician, unrestricted by morals or concerns for the innocents who would inevitably suffer in war. They are collateral after all. Bane was also able to use or create any weapon at will for use on the battlefield, and history has shown that Bane as a god has died before, only to eventually emerge in a spectacular resurrection. Beyond that, Bane hasn't been known to have performed any other great divine act or infused any of his followers with any special powers beyond the norm, preferring to keep a distant watch over his faithful on the promise that they will rise and earn their way through their own actions and strength, rather than relying purely on his divine gifts. However, there are many stories where Bane would possess an individual in order to confront, say, a deity who decided to intervene in his course of action. This possessed person would take on a twist-spiked form with black leathery skin, talon-like claws, and Bane would also gain their natural powers as well as a distinct immunity to psionic control, one of the few things that could be used to bypass possession and other forms of magical influence. In terms of Bane's relationship with other gods and entities, as I previously said, Bane was one of the few dark gods who was willing to form alliances and work with others, even those who he would seem vehemently opposed to. This is most apparent in his alliance with the Dead Three, a group of 3 legendary mortal villains who tore through all manner of realms and extraplanar creatures to make their way to Jergal, the god of death, from whom they demanded pieces of his power. The other 2 members, Baal and Mirkul, one of which we've covered in a previous video, would also become gods in their own right alongside Bane in a fateful game of Knucklebones. And while they each initially took up domains in order to try and spite or one-up one another, they actually ended up accidentally creating a loop where they must permanently interact with one another in the system of transference from life to death. As such, the 3 keep a tense but forcibly amicable relationship to one another, which I see as akin to powers engaged in a Cold War, their agents working behind the scenes to try and transfer power to their respective patrons. Other gods that Bane aligned with through both fear and mutual interest included Loviatar, Talana, and Mask, as well as the dark dwarven god Abathor, the goblinoid gods Maglubiet and Hugrek, and the monstrous deities Tiamat and Malar. Then there's also the seldom mentioned half-demon son of Bane, known as Yaktu-Zim, who served as a lesser deity of the same portfolio as Bane before the god used his body to resurrect himself upon being defeated by the god Torm. There are some records that say it was actually Tyr who killed Bane, but either one really fits. Speaking of enemies, Bane's greatest foes included gods like Melora, who despised how his war engines heralded the destruction of nature, Mystra, whose command over magic he coveted for his own goals, and the good-aligned triad of Torm, Tyr, and Ilmater, who were responsible for his first godly death. Bane was also known to have frequent conflict with the god Cyric, due to the latter's penchant for killing Bane's followers and stealing the domains and worshippers of other gods. Hematator, Ogma, and Helm were also thought to be amongst his distinct foes. Now, the Church of Bane has ebbed and flowed in terms of size and power, due to both the death of its god at one time and its suffering the purges at the hand of the opposing Church of Cyric. Despite the ups and downs, however, the Church of Bane has always been dedicated to its cause and unified in its order, holding a strict hierarchy where the strong rule and the weak serve. Higher-ups in the church were shown respect by their subjects via kissing of their rings, hands, and even feet, depending on how distant they were rank-wise. The High Imperceptor was the most powerful priest in the church's hierarchy. Below him were other ranks such as Vigilators, Dreadmasters, Vigilants, Black Fangs, the Watchful, and finally, Slaves, who were the new blood acolytes who just joined and still had to prove their worth. Worshippers of Bane did not hide their devotion unless it was done in the service of bettering the god's reach or gaining an advantage during wartime, and were often seen wearing black and red while always ensuring that they were armed with at least one weapon. Warriors wore spiked armor and full plate, while mages wore black and red and sometimes green robes, the more zealous of which would enchant them to give off the visage of stars or flowing blood in their details. In a more subtle manner, worshippers of Bane would wear a simple black gauntlet on one hand in place of all the fanfare. Baneites, as they were called, were also known for their penchant to have facial tattoos, which often gave themselves away when discovered by the more religiously literate. Baneites were also known to carry special Bane swords, which were specifically +1 longswords that dealt additional damage to creatures of the chaotic alignment, such as Fae or demons. Now, in terms of distinct canon clerical orders of Bane, there are primarily 2 that I was able to find. The first one would be commonly known as the Zentarum, which is more of a mercenary company and criminal organization than an actual divine church, originally being formed by the archwizard Manshun, and comprising of a great deal of Bane worshippers. They mostly dealt in the trading of illicit goods and the building of mercantile properties, recruiting many monstrous races and outright monsters to protect and serve in the army's ranks. Now, this is a monstrous glossing over of the organization as a whole, and it really does deserve its own video, which I may do in the future, but I highly recommend checking it out as a great source of villains or campaign plots. Then there's the Knights of the Gauntlet, an order of Bane-worshipping crusaders known to have helmed horrors serving in their ranks, either by creating the constructs themselves or discovering them in some ancient ruin. The Knights of the Gauntlet were most well known for their use of extraplanar travel in their crusades, as well as being one of the only churches to maintain faith during both the time that Bane had died at Torm's hand, and during the purging of Bane's faithful by the Church of Cyric. This does speak both to their devotion and their sheer survivability, with most of its members being made up of recruited mercenaries. And they are also credited with the creation of one of Bane's artifacts, the Scepter of the Tyrant's Eye, which we will cover later on in this video. In terms of divine rituals that the Church of Bane takes part in, most were conducted by higher-up senior members of the clergy, but held little correlation to things like seasons, moon phases, or any other traditional events that most churches would use to mark their devotion. As such, there was no real holiday or distinct time where worship of Bane was considered strongest or at its height. Instead, these rituals were made with a distinct purpose and conducted for very specific reasons, such as sacrifices to ensure victory or swearing of oaths of devotion to the cause by expanding Bane's influence. This was often accompanied by the creation of a black altar, which was a plain stone block sometimes formed out of obsidian or painted or draped in black, and accompanied by either a floating stone sculpture of the Hand of Bane or an empty throne that faced the space of the ritual. From there, services would include rhythmic chanting, drums, and sometimes ritualistic torture to either extract pain from the victim or to expunge or dull one's reaction to pain in order to better serve the Black Hand. Baneite clerics were also known to pray for their spells at midnight. In terms of canon artifacts related to Bane that exist, here are a couple that I was actually able to dig up and translate to 5th edition for you guys. First off, we have the Hand of Bane, which is a special artifact created by the Church as an instrument in order to resurrect Bane should he ever be killed again, carved from a large chunk of obsidian and studded with diamonds, rubies, and garnet. While it is believed that this item once resided in the multiplanar city of Sigil, it is said to have since been destroyed by a priestess of Bane, either due to no longer having use of it or in order to make sure that his enemies could never find it and use it against him. Next, there is the Scepter of the Tyrant's Eye, a +3 heavy mace created by one of Bane's High Imperceptors, Teldorn Darkhope. Used as both a weapon and a badge of rank within the Church, the scepter could trap the souls of those it killed, sap the strength of non-Baneite creatures who attempted to use it, and most notably, grant the wielder immunity to all forms of Beholder eye rays. I think from this we can glean exactly why the scepter was made and what it was used to fight against. Imagine a villain for your campaign being a Bane priest who has used the scepter in order to get a Beholder to kneel to him. The scepter could also be used to cast the following spells without requiring material components, that being Fly, True Strike, Hold Monster, and Circle of Death. Next is the Black Lord's Cloak, an artifact that wasn't created by the Church, but was instead worn by Bane during his mortal life. Upon ascension, it was also infused with divine power and could forcibly constrict someone and absorb their blood before leaving them a desiccated husk. It's an oddly specific power, but I imagine it does actually help to have your cape really watch your back. Fourth, from the deep recesses of issue 333, page 48 of Dragon Magazine, we have the Rod of Clenched Fists, which is a +2 light mace that was literally forged to be in the shape of 4 fists stacked on top of one another. From its design alone, you can tell that this is an old item, but the rod could be used to cast the spell Bane at will, the spell Vampiric Touch 3 times a day, and the spell Dominate Person once per day, all of which are using your spell save DC. It was also apparently priced at a hefty 425,000 gold, and required the wielder to be a worshipper of Bane, lest the spells be used against those who tried to wield it and didn't hold the proper faith. And finally, for the more modern iterations of the game, we have the Bloody End, an adamantine morning star with a blade on the pommel and foot-long spikes at its head. This weapon could be found on the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount on page 278, as exemplifying it here in too heavy a detail might sadly get Pinkerton agents knocking at my door. Continuing, when running NPCs, cultures, militaries, or nations that worship Bane, make sure to take his favorite colors, symbols, and monsters into account. Having soldiers walk around with black gauntlets marking their devotion, having defeated nations change their heraldry to black, red, or green to signify their defeat, as well as swearing public fealty to their new rulers. Bane's view of strength and strife can inspire those who struggle through life to push and persevere through hardship, eventually becoming worthy of his attention. This can range from simple peasants working their hands to the bone on a harvest to survive the winter, to soldiers who are pushing through a great war in the name of their faction or their kingdom. Bane has also had a very strange tie to the Orcish and Goblinoid races, both in the base lore and in the most recent adaptations for Critical Role, and this could emerge from the unfortunate fact that goblins and orcs are portrayed as predominantly warmongering races, so let's add a few new ancestries into the mix for some more diversity. This could be in the form of high elf blade singers who mastered the Dance of Death in Bane's honor, halfling or gnome warlords who have forsaken their hospitable ways in order to become stronger and defend their oppressed people. There's literally a ton of different stories that could be told about how many different people in the world could find their way to the worship of Bane the Black Hand. Likewise, when role-playing Bane himself, I suggest showing him as a larger-than-life figure whose mere presence commands respect. He is deadly, and as a god of strife, has known the harshness of life and struggled since his days as a mortal, and even now into his time as a god. Toils and works and pushes through all resistance to ensure that his will and the will of those who follow him is done. And as such, Bane will speak matter-of-factly and in pure absolutes. Bane is ultimately not afraid of war and battle, as his followers are more than willing to fight tooth and nail to the bitter end, and from this he exploits the fear that other gods have for their faithful and their worship, as the loss of worshippers means a loss of power. Sometimes that threat is just enough to get an enemy to back down, but other times, either by arrogance or genuine thought that they can win against Bane, a war will be started, and Bane will be allowed to unleash his full brutality. Now, in terms of how we can flavor certain classes and subclasses to match alongside Bane, here are a couple ideas that I have. Artificers fit very well alongside Bane, predominantly in the conceptualization and development of war engines and setting the precedent for modern warfare. The things artificers create can be very useful on the battlefield, and great big guns and sets of living armor are more than enough to intimidate a nation to bend the knee. A good example could be a Battlesmith Knight of the Gauntlet with a helmed horror like Steel Defender at its side, which could make for a very remarkable visage. Now for barbarians, due to their focus on instinct over discipline, their role within the ranks of Bane would be carefully tended to. Berserkers and battle ragers can rely on their sheer physical might and spiked armor. Ancestral guardian barbarians can conjure up and lead spectral warriors to fight even beyond death. And zealot barbarians can channel his divine power directly while in the midst of combat. And when it comes to bards, heroic stories and fluttery songs don't really benefit Bane that much, but the performance of war ballads and the use of propaganda can motivate armies to overcome all manner of overwhelming odds. Those of the colleges of swords and valor can do battle right alongside their warrior brethren, whilst bards from the colleges of whispers and eloquence can influence those on the enemy side to surrender or even betray their own in the hopes of holding a higher rank in Bane's new order. For clerics, in 5th edition, Bane is labeled as only holding the domains of Order, War, and sometimes Forge, but I would also include those of Arcana, Death, Grave, Knowledge, and Twilight under his belt as well. His coveting of Mystra's domain of magic can reflect in the creation of his own Arcana clerics. Death, Twilight, Grave, Order, and War clerics can rend the battlefield asunder or prevent their own forces from perishing. And Knowledge clerics can provide divinely powered tactics, intelligence, and approaches to combat when it comes to leading his forces. Now, Druids would be one of the harder classes to match Bane's tenets, especially given his opposition to the goddess Melora specifically, but that's not to say that all hope is lost for the hopeful Bane-worshipping Druid player. Circle of Spores views the cycle of life and death, birth and decay, and creation and destruction as an often overlooked or often ignored part of the natural order, and could join Bane's Legion in order to help curve the balance via cleaving wild, overgrown nature through rot and blight, sort of like trimming branches and roots so they don't grow and infest through the rest of the world. And then, of course, there's the Circle of Wildfire, whose innately destructive tendencies and healing capabilities can be immensely useful for Bane's purposes, given the frequency of burning down cities during sacks and sieges. Now, for fighters, almost all fighter subclasses can find a place within the ranks of Bane's Legion, from Echo Knights serving as armies of one, Battle Masters and Champions cleaving through the battlefield on skill and discipline alone, and Arcane Archers, Rune Knights, and Eldritch Knights wielding destructive arcane magic across the entire warfront. On the flip side, monks, due to their frequent neutral stances and focus on development of the self, may have a hard time aligning with Bane's largely self-serving and tyrannical ideology. But those who believe that what the Black Hand is doing is right can meditate, study, and beholden themselves to discipline in his name. As such, monks who follow the way of mercy can both heal their allies and harm their foes, while those who follow the ways of the Long Death, Open Hand, and Shadow can work as specialized martial and scouting forces, studying the weaknesses of the body in order to better target and exploit them. Perhaps Bane may have a monistic force that identifies them by only wearing one piece of armor, that being the distinctive spiked gauntlet of the Black Hand. For paladins, swearing an oath of conquest is the easiest one to choose, but those who swear oaths of devotion to the cause, oaths to the crown of a Bane-worshipping nation, or oaths of the Watchers to kill and subjugate extraplanar foes can also fit very well. And of course, oathbreakers who forsake their old gods to follow the Black Hand can make for great additions, along with their newly acquired legions of undead. Rangers aren't as tied down to the world of nature as druids are, offering them a degree of flexibility that allows them to find a place within Bane's fold. They can map the wilderness and scout out enemy territory in preparation for invasion, and all of the subclasses add their own little bit of flavor in the mix, such as Beastmasters having black hunting dogs, or Horizon Walkers working to battle distinctly extraplanar creatures like angels or fae. And furthermore, look at Bane's favorite animals for ranger companion ideas such as bloodhounds or bat swarms for swarmkeepers. Rogues of all sorts make for great infiltrators, spies, and scouts during wartime, with each subclass being able to find a use within the Black Hand's efforts to bring the world to heel. Thieves can steal intel or magic items to turn the tide, masterminds can work as spy masters or tacticians, phantoms and scouts can infiltrate to learn about enemy forces, and arcane tricksters and assassins can do what they do best. Now, when it comes to sorcerers, most of those with magical bloodlines could easily be conscripted into the service of Bane's armies, but I do find that the Clockwork Soul specifically matches the Black Hand's want for cosmic order under his own banner. Then, of course, there is the Divine Soul Sorcerer who carries direct ties to gods, so one of either lawful or evil alignment could be of great use. You could even flavor their wings to be black like those of a carrion bird, or made completely out of metal in reference to Bane's armored visage, like Archangel from the X-Men. When it comes to Warlocks, the Fiend's penchant for resistance and destruction and the Celestial's healing utility are both great for opposite roles within the Black Hand's forces, but nothing for me fits more than Bane creating a sentient weapon for a Hexblade to carry into battle. Cutting down foes and resurrecting them as specters to fight for you sounds exactly like something Bane would approve of, allowing one to wield both magic and martial prowess as the ultimate soldier of tyranny. And finally, despite Bane's penchant for physical warfare and combat, almost all wizard subclasses could match and serve under him from an intellectual and tactical perspective. One must be well read and educated to even have the hopes of becoming a wizard, and each school has something to offer that will give Bane's forces strength and leverage on the path to conquest. With that out of the way, let's talk about quest hooks and NPCs that could be aligned with Bane. Most of them would be concerned with the simple expansion of Bane's influence, which can be done in a variety of different ways. Your party can be tasked with taking over a stronghold for a Bane-focused faction or nation, warring on the front lines as hired mercenaries, or they could acquire a specific magic item that could help the efforts of the current conflict. The simplicity of Bane's ideology makes it easy to adopt a number of different quests to match, and a group can spend an entire campaign fighting in a war to expand the Black Hand's territories to new horizons. Or on the flip side, they can fight against these forces in the name of an opposing god or group. Melora-worshipping druids, or the Emerald Enclave itself from Faerun, can make for great enemies against Bane's forces, as well as other dark gods such as Asmodeus or the other members of the Dead Three. They would love to see him depowered in order to kind of fill that spot on the chain that Jergal had set out for them. For NPCs specifically, they can range from your classic warmongering zealot to cunning tacticians and politicians who seek to grow their own personal power. It doesn't have to always be about the whole, as people who worship Bane can be both noble and self-serving. In terms of monsters, Bane has no problem with making deals with devils and other outsiders to fill his armies. Redcap shock troops, Death Knight generals, fire giant warsmiths, null berserkers, Death Pact angels created by Bane or recruited from other faiths, hobgoblin captains leading goblin infantry who are riding on wargs and nightmares, dark elf oathbreakers who forsook Loth's way of political intrigue in favor of Bane's boothed strength. The options are really vast and almost infinite for a bunch of cool things you guys can do. Creature-wise, most soldiers and scouts could have Black Dog, Hellhound, or Shadow Mastiff companions, and armies can form alliances with green or black dragons, which could be devastating for the enemy side. And of course, don't forget my previous suggestion for someone having the Scepter of the Tyrant's Eye, bending a beholder or even a death tyrant to their whims. Now, for magic items, Bane isn't exactly that picky. He'll find use in almost all things, but favors weapons, armors, staffs of power, and other things that make his people physically stronger and more difficult to fight or resist. Aesthetically, black metal, obsidian, and other black and red stones, emeralds, carnelians are all great for theming with your magic items, especially if they've been taken off a Bane-worshipping foe or is gifted to a player by a Black Hand-worshipping NPC. And lastly, for our homebrew magic item this evening, we have the All-Gauntlet, a +1 spiked gauntlet that requires attunement and can be used as a simple weapon dealing both piercing or bludgeoning damage equal to 1d6 plus your strength and dexterity modifiers. Additionally, the gauntlet can be activated as a bonus action and be turned into any simple or martial melee weapon, while also increasing its bonus from +1 to +2. And lastly, also as a bonus action, you may choose one enemy within 60 feet that you can see to be the target of this ability. For 1 minute, all attacks you make against this enemy are made with a 1d6 bonus to attack rolls, and if you reduce the enemy to 0 HP during this time, this ability replenishes and you may choose a new target as a reaction. If you do not have a new enemy to choose within range, or you do not use your reaction to recast this ability, it ends and cannot be used until your next short rest. It's a very simple and straightforward item this time around. And with that, that's our coverage of Bane the Black Hand, everybody. I want to thank all of you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and press the little bell icon in the corner to be notified of future videos. Also, let me know in the comments how you guys have encountered or used Bane in your games, and also what you guys would like to see in upcoming videos. But until then, I'll see you guys next time.